Okay, so, if you're anything like me, you're the kind of person who really gets a kick out of those deep philosophical questions about, like, the very nature of our minds, what's going on in there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially how our thoughts, like, how can our thoughts be about things?
Exactly. That's what we're diving into today, this whole idea of how our subjective experience, like what it feels like to be us, connects to the objective world out there. We're talking phenomenal intentionality.
And well, the idea is that the aboutness of our thoughts, the directedness towards things, it's rooted in the very feeling of those thoughts, of what it's likeness. Phenomenal consciousness.
Right. And our roadmap for this deep dive, our like trusted guide, is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on phenomenal intentionality,
Right.
right?
It's the go-to resource. It's a bit dense, I'll be honest,
Mm.
but for anyone seriously thinking about philosophy of mind, this entry is the gold standard for understanding this debate.
So we're aiming to unpack this dense but essential concept, right? Like lay out the main arguments for why philosophers find this theory so compelling and also, hit on some of the big objections and what those mean for our picture of the mind.
All of it, yeah.
Yeah.
But tailored for a philosophical mind, right?
Yeah.
We're not going to rehash the basics here.
Exactly. So first things first, intentionality and phenomenal consciousness. These are the two big ideas we need to get a handle on.
Yeah, got to start with the building blocks. So intentionality, think of it as the aboutness of mental states. Like when you have a thought that snow is white, that thought isn't just some random thing happening in your brain. It's about snow and its whiteness.
It's directed at something, right?
Sure.
Pointing towards something, even if that something is abstract.
Right, there's this directedness, this pointing. And that has two aspects. We've got the intentional property, which is like the inherent capacity of the mental state to represent something, and then the intentional content, which is the specific thing it represents.
So in our snow example, the property is that the thought is capable of representing something, and the content is like snow is white.
Exactly. Okay, now on the flip side, we have phenomenal consciousness, which is all about the subjective feel of experience, the what it's likeness.
It's like knowing that fire is hot versus actually feeling the burn.
Exactly. That feeling is the phenomenal character.
Yeah.
Perceptions like seeing a color or feeling pain, emotions, mental images, even that weird deja vu feeling, they all have this phenomenal quality.
So we've got intentionality, that aboutness, and we've got phenomenal consciousness, the raw feel. How does phenomenal intentionality bring these two together? What's the core idea here?
Okay, so phenomenal intentionality, PIT for short, says that intentionality is actually constituted by phenomenal consciousness.
Not just that some conscious states happen to be about things, but that the very feeling of the state makes it about that thing.
Yeah, like think of seeing a red cube. The PIT theorists would say that the phenomenal character of that experience, that reddish cubish feeling, it automatically leads to the representation of a red cube.
So the feeling itself is the representing, not just correlated with it.
Right. That's a key difference from other views. Now, this leads to a distinction, right? We've got phenomenal intentional states, where the consciousness is doing the grounding, and non-phenomenal intentional states, which don't have that direct grounding and feeling.
So like a deeply held belief that you haven't thought about in ages, a PIT theorist would need to explain how that's intentional if it's not currently being felt.
Exactly. PIT takes this consciousness-first approach. Consciousness is primary. It's either the ground or the explanatory starting point for intentionality.
Okay, but PIT isn't just this one monolithic thing, right? There are different flavors, different strengths of the theory.
Oh, yeah, definitely. You've got weak PIT, moderate PIT, and strong PIT. Each has a different take on how far this phenomenal intentionality goes.
All right, let's break those down. What does it mean to be a weak PIT theorist?
Well, the weak version is the most, I guess you could say, the most minimal commitment. It just says that some intentional states are phenomenal intentional states. So if you believe that perceptual experiences, like seeing a red apple, are both conscious and about the world, you're already a weak PIT theorist.
So even if you just believe that our experiences of the world are representational, you're in the weak PIT camp.
Exactly. It's a pretty low bar, honestly. Representationalism about consciousness, which many people find plausible, already entails weak PIT.
Okay, so what about moderate PIT? What makes that the, main event in the PIT world?
Moderate PIT is where things get more interesting, and it's where most of the action is. It claims that all intentional states are either themselves phenomenal intentional states, or they're at least partly grounded in phenomenal intentional states.
Okay, so we need to talk about grounding here. What does that mean in this context?
Grounding is a kind of metaphysical dependence, like one thing depends on another for its existence. So B is grounded in A if A makes B the case, if A explains B.
It's like the foundation.
Yeah, exactly. And the partly grounded bit acknowledges that other stuff might be involved too, not just phenomenal consciousness, but phenomenal consciousness is a crucial part of the story.
So if I believe that, say, cats are better than dogs, even if I'm not actively thinking about it right now, a moderate PIT theorist would say that belief gets its aboutness from some past or potential phenomenal experience.
Right. And there are different ways to spell out that grounding. One way is through dispositions, like Searle argues. So that belief about cats is a disposition to have conscious experiences or thoughts about cats being superior, under the right conditions.
Like a mental program, ready to run when you encounter a cat or someone who disagrees. What are some other ways they explain this grounding?
Another is through functional rules, championed by folks like Lohr, Horgan, and Tiensen. They say that the intentional state gets its content through how it interacts with other phenomenal states, like your perception of cats, your memories of them, your emotional reactions, all that.
So the non-conscious belief is embedded in a network that's ultimately rooted in conscious experience.
Exactly. And then there's the idea of ideal rational interpretation. From Kriegel and Potts, this is a bit more abstract, but the idea is that even our non-conscious beliefs have content because of how a perfectly rational being would interpret our overall mental states, including potential phenomenal states. So it's like there's an objective standard based on how consciousness works that even applies to our non-conscious beliefs.
That's wild. So all these different grounding mechanisms, dispositions, functional roles, ideal interpretation, they're all ways of connecting seemingly non-conscious beliefs back to phenomenal consciousness.
Yeah, that's the name of the game in moderate PIT. It's definitely the most popular, most debated version.
What about strong PIT? Where does that fit in?
Strong PIT takes it all away. It says that all intentional states, without exception, are phenomenal intentional states. So even standing beliefs, abstract thoughts about math, everything has to be constituted by phenomenal consciousness.
Like even the belief in the Pythagorean theorem has to have some kind of feeling associated with it. That seems like a really hard sell.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Proponents like Pitt, Farkas, and Mendelevici, they argue for it, but it definitely faces an uphill battle, especially explaining the phenomenology of those really abstract, seemingly non-experiential thoughts. It's a pretty radical view.
Definitely. Okay, so beyond these strength distinctions, we also have grounding views and identity views. What's the difference there?
Good point. So grounding views, like we talked about with moderate PIT, say that phenomenal intentional states are distinct from the phenomenal states that ground them. They're caused by them or made true by them, but they're not the same thing. Like the reddish experience causes the representation of red, but they're different things.
Okay, so it's a causal relationship.
Right. People like Farkas, maybe Pitt,
Yeah.
maybe even Horgan and Tiensen fall into this camp. Identity views, on the other hand, say that phenomenal intentional states are the phenomenal states themselves, just viewed under different descriptions. Mendelevici is a big proponent of this. So the reddish experience just is the representation of red, no two ways about it.
So it's not a separate thing, just another way of talking about the same mental event.
Yep. And this connects to the question of reduction, right? Like, is PIT trying to reduce intentionality to something else? Is it saying intentionality isn't really fundamental?
Okay, yeah, that's an important point. Does it get rid of intentionality altogether?
Well, grounding views, by their very nature, are reductive. They're saying that intentionality is grounded in phenomenal states that aren't themselves intentional. So you're explaining intentionality in terms of something more basic, those raw feels.
Breaking it down to its fundamental components.
Exactly. Identity views can go either way. If you think phenomenal descriptions are more basic, then you're reducing intentionality to phenomenal consciousness. But some might say those descriptions are equally fundamental, leading to a non-reductive PIT.
So even if they don't completely get rid of intentionality, they're still often trying to explain it in terms of something more fundamental, like consciousness.
Yeah, that's a common thread. And just to throw it out there are other variations too, like how far does phenomenal intentionality extend? Just perception or thoughts too. Does non-phenomenal intentionality even exist? What's the structure of it? Is it relational or just an intrinsic property? Lots to debate.
Okay, so we've got a solid grasp on what PIT is, the different flavors, the key distinctions. Now for the big question, why? Why would a philosopher think this theory is a good idea?
Right. Good question. Well, there are a bunch of compelling arguments for PIT, and they come from different angles. One of the most influential is what Horgan and Teenson call the phenomenological case.
Okay, the phenomenological case. Lay it on me.
It starts with this intuition that intentionality and phenomenal consciousness are so tightly interwoven in our experience that they're almost inseparable, like two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other.
So they're saying that experience inherently has meaning and that thoughts have a certain feel to them?
Yep. They put this in terms of two principles: IOP, the intentionality phenomenology, and POI, the phenomenology of intentionality. IOP says that our typical phenomenal states, like seeing a red apple, they inherently have intentional content that you just can't separate from the qualitative character.
Mm-hmm.
You don't experience redness in a vacuum. You experience it as a property of an object, the apple located in space, all that.
Right. It's not just a blob of redness. It's part of a whole scene directed towards the apple.
Exactly. Now, POI, it says that our paradigmatic intentional states, like our conscious beliefs and desires, they also have this inseparable phenomenal character when they're happening. So thinking isn't just this dry, abstract process. It has a feel to it.
Okay, so IOP experience has meaning built in. POI thought has feeling built in. How do these two principles get us to PIT?
Well, they use this thought experiment about phenomenal duplicates. Imagine two beings with identical experiences their whole lives. Because of IOP, those duplicates would have to share a lot of their perceptual contents, right? Same experiences, same stuff those experiences are of.
Because their inner lives are identical, what they see and perceive is also going to be the same.
Right. And then they argue those shared perceptual contents, they lead to shared beliefs about the world, and that leads to a lot of overlap in their beliefs and desires overall. So phenomenal consciousness, with its built-in intentionality, it kind of anchors and shapes our whole mental life.
Okay, so the feeling of experience drives the bus, so to speak. But this mainly gets us to weak PIT, right?
You got it. It shows that at least some intentional states are phenomenal intentional states.
But what about the moderate and strong versions?
Well, Mendelevici has another argument based on this idea of metaphysical sufficiency. She says that other theories of intentionality, like tracking theories or functional role theories, they don't really explain why certain physical processes should be about anything. Like, why should this pattern of neurons firing mean rabbit and not something else?
Right, it's like, why should that physical stuff have any meaning at all?
Exactly. But she says PIT can explain this. Phenomenal consciousness, she argues, it has this intrinsic representational power. It makes sense that a reddish experience would represent redness. It's metaphysically sufficient for intentionality.
So the feeling itself is about redness, no further explanation needed. That's a strong claim.
It is. Okay, and another big argument comes from Seward, and it's all about accessibility for accuracy.
Accessibility for accuracy, okay.
His idea is that phenomenal states are always accessible for accuracy, which means they have to have intentional content. Like, if it seems to you like there's a square in front of you, then your experience is either accurate or inaccurate. Yeah?
Either there is a square or there isn't.
Right. And that possibility of being right or wrong, he says, it's built into the phenomenal experience itself. That's a hallmark of intentionality. So the experience itself has to have intentional content.
So the seeming of the experience is already making a claim about the world, and that claim can be judged as true or false.
Exactly. Now, there are objections to this, of course. Gertler, for example, argues that maybe it's the other way around, that intentionality gives rise to the phenomenality. But Seward has responses to those.
Okay, so the relationship between seeming and accuracy is complex. What about internalism and the brain in a vat? How do those connect to PIT?
This is a classic line of argument. Internalism about mental content, as you know, it says that the content of our thoughts is determined by what's going on inside our heads, not by the outside world.
It's all about our internal states.
Right. And the brain in a vat thought experiment, it really pushes on this. Like, imagine a brain floating in a vat, hooked up to a supercomputer that's feeding it perfectly simulated experiences. The intuition is that that brain would have the same mental life as its embodied counterpart.
Same experiences, same thoughts, even though it's not connected to a real world.
Yeah. And PIT explains this, right? Both brains have the same phenomenal consciousness, so they have the same intentional contents, even if those contents don't refer to anything real in the vat case. So Lohr uses this to argue for a kind of PIT that can satisfy both internalism and externalism about mental content.
How does this satisfy both?
He says that phenomenal properties are inherently intentional, like they have this internal aboutness, but they don't refer to anything specific until they're connected to the external world. So my internal experience of Water-ishness is the same whether I'm on Earth or twin Earth, but what I'm actually thinking about, H2O or XYZ, that depends on the environment.
So PIT gives you the internal, narrow content, and then the environment adds the external, broad content.
Right. And Farkas takes this even further, arguing that maybe we don't need externalism at all, that phenomenally constituted intentionality is all there is. Pretty radical stuff.
Okay, so our intuitions about the brain and Yvette, they lend support to this idea that phenomenal consciousness plays a key role in determining content, even if the world doesn't match up.
Exactly. Now, Searle has another argument based on what he calls a spectral shape.
Spectral shape. Explain.
It's not just what you represent, but how you represent it. Like thinking of Hesperus versus thinking of phosphorus. Both refer to Venus, but they have different modes of presentation, different aspectual shapes.
It's like the way you're conceiving of the thing, the specific aspects you're focusing on.
Exactly. And Searle says that only conscious states, or states that could be conscious, can determine that aspectual shape. Unconscious physical stuff, it just can't do that.
So my unconscious belief that I left my phone in the living room, it only has that specific shape because it's connected to the possibility of me consciously thinking about it in that way.
Right. That's his connection principle. Unconscious intentionality is derived from conscious intentionality.
Okay, so consciousness is necessary for that fine-grained aspectual shape, but this has been challenged, right?
Yeah, definitely. Some argue that unconscious states, like those in cognitive science, they might have their own intrinsic aspectual shape, independent of consciousness.
Another point of contention. What about this problem of content determinacy? How does PIT fit in there?
Oh, this is a good one. It's the problem of how purely physical stuff can determine specific meanings. Like, how can a brain state mean rabbit and not undetached rabbit parts?
Or plus versus quus, that weird Kripkean function.
Yeah, how do we get from the physical to the meaningful? It's like the Martian thought experiment.
Yeah.
Right. If a Martian was looking at our brains, how could they ever figure out what we're thinking?
Our brains would just look like a bunch of physical processes with no obvious meaning.
Exactly. But PIT theorists like Graham, Horgan, Teens, and Strawson, they argue that phenomenal consciousness can solve this. They appeal to cognitive phenomenology, the idea that there's a specific what it's like to thinking about different things, like rabbits versus rabbit parts.
So the feeling of thinking itself helps to fix the content.
Right. If those phenomenal experiences are different, then PIT can explain how our states get their specific meanings. Of course, this hinges on accepting cognitive phenomenology, which is controversial, but it's a powerful response to a really tough problem.
It's fascinating how PIT ties these deep problems of meaning to the subjective feel of thought. What about thoughts about things that don't exist, like unicorns or Santa Claus? How can we represent what isn't real if intentionality is grounded in actual experience?
This is where Kriegel comes in with a really clever argument.
Yep.
He points out that a lot of theories say intentionality involves a relation to the thing being represented, but that's a problem for non-existent things, like what are we relating to when we think about unicorns?
Right, there's nothing there to have a relationship with.
Exactly. So he rejects those relational views and favors a non-relational account he calls adverbialism. It's like representing a unicorn isn't about having a relation to a unicorn. It's about being in a certain kind of mental state. A unicorn-wise state, the aboutness, is in the way you're experiencing or thinking, not in a link to an external object.
So it's not that my thought is pointing to a unicorn out there in the world. It's that my thought has a particular unicorn-ish quality.
Exactly. And PIT fits this perfectly. Those non-relational intentional properties, they can be phenomenal properties. Our feelings are intrinsic, right? And there are good reasons to think they have this inherent intentionality. So PIT, especially the non-relational kind, can handle thoughts about non-existence.
Okay, so PIT gives us a way to think about fictional things, mythical creatures, all that, without having to posit weird relations to non-existent things.
Right. Of course, there are still people who defend relational views, like odd, but phenomenal intentionalists have ways of responding to those. It's a lively debate. One last argument I want to mention is the argument from predictive accuracy.
Okay, predictive accuracy, what's that about?
It's the idea that a good theory of intentionality should correctly predict what our mental states are about, especially in those really obvious cases. Like when we see red, we're pretty sure we're representing redness.
Seems straightforward.
Right, but some theories struggle with this. Like if redness is a primitive non-physical property, what are we tracking when we see red?
How can we be causally related to something non-physical?
Exactly. But PIT, they argue, gets this right, because the phenomenal character of our experience matches the represented property. It's a good fit. Mendelovici calls this the argument from matching.
So PIT nails those basic cases of perception because the feeling lines up with the property being represented.
Yeah. It's a point in its favor. And there are other arguments out there, like how PIT might ground norms of rationality, or how consciousness might be needed to determine whose thought a thought is, but we don't have time for all that today. The point is there are good reasons to take PIT seriously.
Okay, so compelling arguments for sure. But let's be honest, PIT has its critics too. It runs into some pretty big challenges.
Oh, absolutely. Especially when it comes to those states that seem intentional but don't have a clear phenomenal character. And when PIT theorists run into these challenges, they usually take one of three approaches: eliminativism, inflationism, or derivativism.
Okay, break those down for me. Eliminativism, inflationism, derivativism.
Eliminativism, it's like saying, okay, this state isn't really intentional in the way we're talking about. Inflationism says, no, it does have phenomenal character, we're just not seeing it. And derivativism says, all right, maybe it's not directly phenomenal, but its intentionality comes from something that is phenomenal.
So deny, inflate, or derive.
Got it. Let's start with thoughts. Where do those cause trouble for PIT?
The problem with thoughts, especially abstract ones, is that they don't seem to have a phenomenology that's rich enough to capture their content. Like, think about a complex mathematical theorem or a philosophical argument. It doesn't feel like there's a specific what its likeness that could capture all those nuances.
Right. It's more like words in your head, maybe some vague images, not a symphony of feeling. Exactly. So how can PIT, which is all about grounding intentionality and feeling, account for that? Well, the inflationist response is to say, no, there is a rich cognitive phenomenology, we just haven't fully appreciated it. People like Strawson, Seward, Organ and Tiensen, Pitt, they argue for this.
So there's a specific feel to understanding that theorem, a qualitative character that makes it different from understanding something else.
That's the idea. But it's a controversial claim. Now, the derivativist approach from folks like Lohr, Bourget, and even Mendelovici in a way, is to say, okay, maybe the immediate phenomenology isn't that rich, but the content comes from the thought's connections to other mental states, which are ultimately phenomenal or grounded in phenomenal states.
So the feeling is like a seed, but the full meaning comes from how that thought is connected to other stuff, which ultimately has its roots in phenomenal consciousness.
Yeah, it's more indirect.
Yeah.
Mendelovici even goes a bit limitedist, saying that those rich conceptual contents are not strictly intentional, but kind of derived representational content.
Okay, so we can either inflate the phenomenology of thought or explain its content through its connections to other more fundamentally phenomenal states. What about standing beliefs, like my belief that the Earth revolves around the sun, even when I'm not actively thinking about it? Those seem even tougher for PIT.
They do, yeah. Because they don't seem to have any phenomenal character when they're just sitting there not being consciously thought about. So nobody really goes for the inflationist strategy here. What you get is eliminativism and derivativism.
Okay, what does eliminativism say about standing beliefs?
Eliminativists, like Strawson and Mendelovici, they say that those standing beliefs, they're not really full-blown intentional states. They're more like dispositions. Dispositions to have certain thoughts or to behave in certain ways.
So my belief that the Earth revolves around the sun is really just a tendency to think about it that way, or to, I don't know, reject flat Earth theories if someone brings them up.
Exactly. It's not a belief with content in the deep sense. It's a potential for phenomenal intentional states or actions. Now, derivativists like Searle, Bourget, Kriegel, they take a different route.
Okay, lay out the derivativist options for me.
Searle says these standing beliefs get their content from our dispositions to have conscious states with that content. So you believe the Earth revolves around the sun because you're capable of consciously thinking that.
Makes sense.
Bourget connects them to occurrent thoughts, which are either phenomenal or derived. And Kriegel, with his interpretivism, says they have content because a perfectly rational being would ascribe that content to us, given our potential phenomenal states.
So different ways of connecting those dormant beliefs back to consciousness. But there's disagreement here, right?
Oh, yeah. Big disagreement about whether dispositions can really count as beliefs. Peacock, for instance, has argued against those simple dispositional accounts. It really gets to the heart of what we even mean by belief and intentional state.
Okay, so standing beliefs, definitely a tough case for PIT. What about wide intentional states, like in the twin Earth thought experiment, where content seems to depend on the environment?
This is another tricky one. Remember Alice on Earth and her twin on Twin Earth? They both have water thoughts, but one is about H2O and the other is about XYZ. How can PIT, which focuses on internal experience, account for that difference?
Right, if their phenomenology is the same, shouldn't their thoughts be about the same stuff?
You'd think so, but there are ways to deal with it. Not many go for inflationism here, although Campbell has defended a kind of broad perceptual experience. But the main strategies are eliminativism and derivativism.
Okay, so eliminativism about wide content, how does that work?
People like Sear, Kriegel, Farkas, Pitt, Mendel, Levici, they say that the twins' thoughts actually have the same narrow content, determined by their shared phenomenology. The difference is in what makes those thoughts true, and that's down to the environment. So they're both thinking something like water-ish stuff, but what that stuff is depends on their world.
So the internal meaning is the same, but the external reference differs.
Exactly. Now, derivativists like Lohr, Horgan and Tiensen, Bourget, Chalmers, they say there are two levels of content. A narrow content, which is phenomenal and shared, and a broad content, which is determined by the narrow content plus the environment. This connects to two-dimensional semantics, which distinguishes between different ways of thinking about meaning.
So PIT can either deny that there's really such a thing as broad content, or it can try to explain it as a kind of secondary meaning built on top of the phenomenal core.
Right. And Potts has this interesting consciousness-based best systems theory that combines these ideas.
Consciousness-based best systems, all right.
It's where rationality, grounded in phenomenal states, helps determine the narrow content, and then the external world fills in the rest. Pretty
Very neat. Okay, last but definitely not least, unconscious occurrence states. These are a big challenge for PIT, right?
Yeah, maybe the biggest. Cognitive science is full of these states that seem to represent stuff and guide our behavior, but they're unconscious. No feeling involved. That seems to go directly against PIT's whole thesis.
It's like our brains are doing all this work behind the scenes without us experiencing any of it.
Right. So how can PIT handle this? Well, there are a few moves. Some, like Searle, just bite the bullet and say, look, only conscious states or potentially conscious states are truly intentional. That puts them at odds with a lot of cognitive science.
A bold stance.
Yeah. Others, like Graham and Mendel-Levici, they try to reconcile things by saying, well, maybe those unconscious states are more like functional states. They do stuff, but they don't have that deep intrinsic intentionality that PIT cares about.
So they're doing work, but not in the same way as conscious states.
Right. And then you have a few, like Bourget and Pitt, who entertain the idea of unconscious phenomenal states, which is wild. And of course, there are derivativist options too. Bourget says maybe they get their content from the larger system, the whole organism interacting with the environment. Kriegel's interpretivism comes into play again too.
So lots of options on the table, but definitely a tough nut to crack for PIT.
For sure. This whole question of unconscious intentionality, it really forces PIT theorists to think carefully about how their view fits with the latest findings from cognitive science. It's a really active area of research.
Okay, so PIT, it's this fascinating theory. It offers a really radical way of thinking about the relationship between consciousness and intentionality, but it faces some serious challenges, especially when we consider all the stuff that seems to be going on in our minds without any conscious awareness.
Absolutely. It's definitely a work in progress, but it raises such deep questions about the nature of our minds and how they connect to the world. It's hard to ignore.
And for you, our listener, the philosopher in the audience, this is a call to introspection. Think about your own thoughts and experiences. Does it feel like the what it's likeness is tied up with the aboutness like PIT suggests? Or is it something else entirely?
Yeah, and here's one final thought to leave you with, a really intriguing one. Imagine a being with totally different phenomenal experiences from ours, like they perceive the world in a way we can't even imagine. Could they still have thoughts with the same intentional content as us?
Could they be thinking about the same things even though their inner world is radically different? That's a mind bender.
It is. And it's so, what does that tell us about the nature of meaning and representation? Something to ponder for sure.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into phenomenal intentionality. Lots to think about, that's for sure.
Definitely. Thanks for having me.
Until next time.
See you then.